fundamentally, we're a nonpartisan organization, and I believe the movement is bipartisan, and I want to project that, but we're just, reality is reality, and this administration at best is creating contradictory unpredictability, but I think at worst, it is a menace to issues that we care about, from racial justice to climate change.
Welcome to YIMBY Nation, a podcast exploring U.S. housing and the roadblocks to building more equitable neighborhoods. Join Jimmy, Peter, and V as they, and special guests, offer their unique perspectives on building more diverse communities and addressing the social problems that emanate from the lack of decent, safe, and affordable housing. Our hosts have served in the fields of advocacy and nonprofit, public, and private development, and are driven by their passion for community empowerment. Join the conversation and share your thoughts on social using hashtag YIMBYNation.
Peter, welcome to YIMBY Nation. We are very excited to have you join us today. Jimmy, Peter, and myself are very excited to have you, Peter, to join us today. For those of us that are not familiar with your work, can you tell us about your journey from being a housing organizer in New York City to now the leading Connecticut Regional Plan Association?
Yeah, I don't think I drew it up that I was going to come back to Connecticut, but I'm very excited for it. But I guess I moved down to New York City after college to write the great American novel, which meant I was a bartender. And had for, most of my 20s, starting into grad school. And I moved into Stuyvesant Town in the East Village, which is MetLife, built in the 1940s, and just a fascinating history, both of construction, but also tenant organizing. And bunch of bartender friends in our 20s, moved in after the Great Recession, got a great deal, market rate apartment. Maybe 11 months later, we got a letter saying we are part of a class action lawsuit. We are retroactively rent stabilized. Our rent went down by $1,100.
Wow.
We got $3,000 back and a new lease. My Catholic guilt kicked in. I said, we've been here for, no time at all. Our neighbor's an original tenant from 1947. How did this happen? So I just got very interested in the lawsuit that happened and the organizing that was going on, and I got involved in tenants association there, and that really piqued my interest in terms of housing justice and all the different structural issues of trying to be a working class person living in New York City. And as I abandoned my dream of writing the great American novel and went back to grad school, I was fascinated by urban planning and scaling up, and really got interested in how do you actually solve this at a structural level. And I'm still very passionate about protecting tenants and home renters, but you've got to look further up and structurally and say, we're not building enough homes. And why is that? And the urban planning structure of all those pieces together just fascinated me. And I got into that world and had an interesting side career of accidental entrepreneur. I was bartending in college and started a startup company with a couple friends, and I was in the tech world in New York City for about a decade. So I was doing volunteer tenant organizing kind of as my night job and doing tech stuff in the day. And I was able to start thinking about how do I do all those things together. And COVID happened, and parents getting older, got married, had a kid, and the opportunity to work with Desegregate Connecticut came up. It's a small enough state, so it wasn't that hard to get in touch with Sarah Baronin and say, hey, I'm from Connecticut. I've got all this background. I've done federal housing policy. I've done startup stuff, and I'm fascinated by this work happening in Connecticut. Can I help? I'm just sitting around in my apartment in New York City. And Sarah and I hit it off, and she was at that point transitioning to the Biden administration for historic preservation. And originally what I thought was going to be maybe write a couple of briefs and do some meetings turned into, hey, do you want to move back up to Connecticut and take the reins on this? And I said yes.
That's incredible. You mentioned historic preservation and Sarah. What is Sarah's your wife?
Sarah Baronin started Desegregate Connecticut. And originally it was just a discrete research project to map out all the zoning jurisdictions. So, Sarah was doing this kind of work in Hartford for a long time, was a professor at UConn Law, And I think 2019, 2020 wanted to put together a research project to actually do some software, some GIS software to map out the zoning of Connecticut across the state. Surprisingly or not surprisingly, there'd never been a statewide zoning atlas anywhere, let alone in Connecticut. So COVID happened, people were home, people were interested in racial justice with the George Floyd murder and subsequent uprisings, and that brought together a lot of people that said, hey, wait a minute, I care about racial justice, and in Connecticut, that comes down to land use policy.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how DesegregateCT took off. And they had helped work on, before I got there, the first statewide zoning reform bill that got passed. It was relatively moderate, but it started this really important conversation about why is Connecticut so economically and racially segregated. And it's not an obvious thing to a lot of people, but that sleepy little planning and zoning commission and the basement of some middle school meets on Monday night for 2 hours is actually a pretty significant part of that. So that's where a lot of this work has started.
Wow. How does it tie into the Historic Preservation Council? You mentioned that. I want to say that because I'm on the council or the Historic Preservation Council.
Well, yeah, I would argue perhaps Sarah's background is historic preservation and she's an architect and a lawyer, and the Biden administration had nominated her to run this Historic Preservation Commission nationally.
Oh.
And as no doubt you all know, in the YIMBY world, there are different pockets of resistance to this sometimes, and a lot of it's good faith, a lot of it's bad faith. And the historic preservation piece is actually a really interesting one where I think Sarah tried to, particularly in older parts of Connecticut, which is a very old state, it's like, that's not a zero-sum game. We can do historic preservation for cultural assets, historic assets, but we need to go forward and figure out ways to adaptive reuse or, preserving parts of something and building in other ways. And that's, I think, a significant issue in an older state like Connecticut in terms of land use policy. So she brought that lens to it.
Oh,
that's not my background, but she has gone on to do the National Zoning Atlas, which is mapping out all the zoning in different states across the country, which has been a pretty interesting project.
You've got a fascinating background, Pete, and let's distinguish ourselves. We'll call you Pete. Since I'm
And you, Peter.
I haven't been Pete since I was in college. But it was interesting for me to hear that you went from organizing to planning. I actually did the same thing. I was the first executive director of Manny Mutual Housing Association of New York in Brooklyn is where we started with Acorn, and then went to Pratt to City and Regional Planning School and got my master's in that and continued and ended up here in Connecticut too. Doing another mutual housing organization, a nonprofit in Stamford that was regional. But at any rate, now you're doing a lot of work statewide with the RPA, correct? You started with Desegregate Connecticut. Is that the name of the...
Yeah, so when DesegregateCT started, RPA was the fiscal sponsor for it. And just the timing of when I was coming on, I was able to raise some money, and RPA thought, hey, this is really cool. We got a great person running it now. Let's take it on as a program. So we have been a program of RPA almost since it started. So I ran Desegregate Connecticut for, 2 or 3 years, and then, got the promotion up to run it. So still very much overseeing Desegregate Connecticut, but also on the transportation side and clean energy side is also very much the work that RPA does. So it's expanding the portfolio, but it all still is deeply interconnected. As we know, you can't really think about transportation policy without land use policy and energy policy. And there's a lot of the crossover of the same folks that want to double track a rail to get more service or build up around a train station or do a solar farm or running into the same kind of anti-homes and NIMBYism. And there's a lot of the skill set, I think, that crosses over, a lot of the messaging that crosses over.
Yeah, we could probably have you as a guest 4 or 5 times, given the range of your experience. There's a lot of that we're interested in that you, in fact, have been involved in. But with YIMBY Town 2025 being hosted in New Haven, what unique perspectives do you hope that Connecticut brings to the national housing conversation this fall?
Yeah, I'm like so excited about the fact that we're doing Town in Connecticut.
Yeah.
And one of the, I think, unique parts about hosting in Connecticut is traditionally, and this started in 2016. It's been in a bunch of different places and it's growing every year, but it has typically been in places that have actually done a lot of upzoning or zoning reforms, and it's where the communities come into. And I really thought of it as a different conversation to say, you know what, there are pockets of Connecticut that are doing amazing things. Certainly New Haven, state level, we're struggling. It's a fight. And this would actually be a galvanizing moment. And I don't actually generally use YIMBY that much. I use Pro Homes as kind of the way to think about it. So this would be a galvanizing moment for Connecticut and bring in folks that maybe are commissioners, maybe mayors for selectmen, or just folks in neighborhoods that are, you know, the way the media covers a lot of this stuff, it always seems like it's so controversial or it's a big change, and having a way that the national movement in very different political contexts and big cities, small towns, rural states, urban states, coastal states, inland states, having all these people in this movement come to Connecticut and talk about that experience, I think would really open up the tent for folks in Connecticut that aren't there yet. And I also think it would be a great way to amplify the actual work that is happening in Connecticut, certainly at the municipal level, certainly in some of the public housing authorities. I mean, the way that DesegregateCT organizes, we have all of the above approach. And that means build all kinds of homes, whether they're publicly owned or privately owned, to own or to rent. It's all a home. The one asterisk is we don't need big homes on large lots. We've got plenty of those in Connecticut. Right. So everything else we need to build, we've got to work at all levels of government, which is hard in Connecticut. And then we've got to connect all these related issues from climate change to racial justice to economic growth. And I think that's a really great lens for the national movement to continue growing. So we made a pretty compelling argument for getting the bid for it. We brought in a lot of folks from New Haven, a lot of folks from Connecticut in the housing space to say, hey, we're excited about this if this comes. And we were able to get it.
That's great.
I'm trying to figure out how to frame my thoughts here, because I've been in housing and urban planning for almost 50 years. So I've been in New Haven since 2005. So I'm trying to visualize New Haven then and now, and thinking about the word desegregate. So I'm trying to get my hands around. We have a tremendous amount of housing development downtown. Most of it is market rate and out of the reach of most moderate and low income households. And most of the neighborhoods we're still in Section 8. 2/3 of our vouchers are in a few neighborhoods, almost all minority neighborhoods. We have very little vouchers in neighborhoods that are non-minority. And in New Haven, there are only a couple of census tracts that are not heavily, poverty burden. And it seems like New Haven may be more segregated now than I remember it being in 2005, especially with all the development downtown. And then I'm thinking, on the other hand, we've had policies and programs that have been to incentivize families to move to outside of these segregated neighborhoods. And many of them have been unsuccessful because we found out a lot of families don't want to move outside their neighborhoods. And there have been studies that shown that when people do move outside the neighborhood, they're not as successful as they are in their own neighborhoods. So I'm always, as a planner, I'm always torn between building up a neighborhood like we did when Quinnipiac Terrace, right? Used to be a horrible housing development. And that's one of the most beautiful areas in New Haven on the Quinnipiac River. The whole neighborhood has become stabilized. A new school, new magnet school. And we've done that in several neighborhoods.
West Rock.
Brookside, 500 units out there. Used to be not a very nice place to live. Those communities are still pretty segregated, but they're much better places to live. and the schools around them have improved, and everything else. So I'm always torn between this move to do zoning in areas so we could have multiple housing on lots that are single family lots now. I'm always torn between this drive, and I'm always torn between improving a neighborhood in the schools where low income persons and persons of color live, as opposed to integrating neighborhoods where they don't live and they don't and they don't succeed as much.
They don't thrive.
They don't thrive as much. I mean, and then there was always this thing when I was in planning. We used to study Anthony Downs, and we used to have that theory of dominance, which is that people, whites primarily, only want to live in an area and go to schools where they're dominant. And once they're no longer the dominant, group in that neighborhood, they move out. So then you get constantly neighborhoods transitioning. And how do you stabilize the neighborhood so that it does become integrated? Because we've seen throughout history that when a neighborhood does get to a tipping point, whites will move out and move to other areas. So there's this constant transition of neighborhoods and transitioning. And then how do you get this neighborhood that is integrated? And schools are integrated. And I've been in this business 50 years, and I'm still torn and about maybe a battle we shouldn't fight and focus on improving our own neighborhoods. So I mean, what are your thoughts? You must tackle this whole internal debate.
What is the appropriate policy?
I don't know.
There's this struggle that you described very well. And look at CHFA and their qualified allocation plan for tax credits. You get all these additional points if you're developing in a wealthier town with better schools.
Drives me nuts.
Yes, exactly.
It drives me nuts when I put an application together. I can't get those points.
Yeah.
Right.
But I want to improve my neighborhood.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a core tension in planning in Connecticut
And policy.
In policy. I mean, and the approaches that we've seen in different decades of planning and even in Connecticut, and this is me editorializing a little bit personally, but there's been this sense of this fair share approach that certainly we're trying to, or some folks in Connecticut are trying to do, based on the Mount Laurel Doctrine in New Jersey and other places. And that to me has been a tension of opportunity in America is in the suburbs. So you got to get people out of the cities. And I think that is the wrong approach. It's the wrong approach objectively, because folks do want to stay in our communities. We should build them up. And the other, elephant in the room here is climate change. And we can't be spreading out and sprawling out and for all the different infrastructure reasons and energy. So we want more people in our cities and more density. And the tension of, we have isolated Black families and Latino families and poor people in our cities and locked the key and thrown them out. And there's been people with entirely good faith that say we've got to get those folks into communities that have the resources. And that's a fight, I think, looking backwards in the 20th century, but there are good intentions there. But how do you get that 21st century view of saying, actually, and certainly in some of the major superstar cities, we do see gentrification of white families, middle-class families coming back to cities because of all those amenities and services. And there are positive externalities for folks in those communities already. But just like in the cities in New Haven and Hartford, Bridgeport, there isn't a lot of ownership in those minority communities. So they're at the rent tension there. And it's immense tension. And I certainly think in the YIMBY movement, there is some folks that are a little bit more market-based and just say, hey, let the market work and these things will work it out. I think there are folks like us that are probably a little bit more progressive-oriented and say, well, wait a minute, we've got to prioritize and figure out how do we protect folks and make everybody a part of this rising tide. And that's it's this other discourse around the country of this scarcity versus abundance. And, Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson just had this book come out, Abundance, and it's been part of the kind of the national discourse about this. But I think that framework is actually really helpful for it. I don't always agree with some of their analysis, but abundance versus scarcity is, we have been working in scarcity in our state policy or federal policy. And how do we think in terms of abundance to say places like New Haven that had urban renewal
as planners being guilty of proposing that, how do we rebuild and heal those wounds? How do we get more people into New Haven, and how do we make sure the folks that are here stay and thrive from that too? And it's a great challenge. I don't pretend to have all the answers for it. And what I'm excited about Uniontown from our perspective and our lens is to have those conversations. We're going to have those conversations about the tensions of gentrification versus development, homeownership versus home rentership. We're going to have Yale is involved in that. We're going to have town and gown discussions about, it's clearly a good thing that Yale is here, but there are tensions and trade-offs for that. We're going to have conversations about Elm Cities, and we need more social housing, and we need some innovative models there. There are people in this movement that don't necessarily agree with that. So it's, the conference is not a like rah, we're doing everything great, let's pat ourselves on the back. I think we're onto something as a movement, and how do we really figure out, where do we go? How do we have these conversations? How do we have the tent big enough where people can come in and say, I disagree with you? And how do we, get the best democratic solution on this stuff? So that's what I'm excited about. We're not coming in with all the answers, but there's some real tensions here that we got to be honest about.
It's tough because even, let's just use New Haven as an example. We are all excited about the transformation that New Haven has right now. The effort of building more affordable housing, and New Haven is more receptive to YIMBY. Yes, in my backyard, let's build because we have a shortage of housing. But we also know that the more we build, desegregation, as you mentioned, along with pro homes, those are intertwined, because the more we build, more people are going to come. But also it has to tie into construction, because now prices are high. So when you build these houses, in order to sustain it, if you don't get the government's subsidized support, then these houses or these apartments are expensive, which means that when it's done, the rents are going to be expensive, which means that you're going to start pushing folks out. And I always kind of wonder about, where is the middle ground, right? Where's the middle ground where Jimmy mentioned, how do we grow the programs that we have in the existing town without bringing new folks in? But how do you also bring new folks in and still make sure that gentrification does not happen? I don't know what the answer is, but that seems to be a cycle that's been going on for years.
Yeah, and I'm sure you've seen this in New Haven. We see this in other parts of the state where there is maybe a little bit of building happening, and it's a luxury apartment, and criticisms on all sides of, we don't want this 3-story high-rise in our town, or affordable for whom comes up. And we don't really have, there isn't a YIMBY state or a YIMBY city that's building the scale that we clearly need. So stuff that is getting built is going to be more expensive. And I often say, like, we're missing that naturally affordable housing because we haven't been building in Connecticut for 50 years. I mean, even going before the Great Recession. So there's a housing stock that should exist that's naturally affordable, that's in these dense communities that we tore down because we built some highways or a parking lot for the New Haven Coliseum or something. And then we tore out our cities and a lot of our housing stock. And it's really hard to put solving that on any given philosophical approach or any policy approach, because the damage that we've done in this country is going to take a long, long time to get out of. And I think we have to be humble as planners, as advocates, to say planners in that era thought the highways were good and they thought the developments were good, and that was the best rational way. I mean, my mother's home in Brooklyn was torn down by Robert Moses to build the Verrazano Bridge. I experienced that in my family. So there were a lot of those mistakes, and I think we have to have a certain humility to say, I personally think some of the problem is zoning restrictions and lack of construction and lack of imagination of what our communities can be. But I don't want to be the only person making that decision. There has to be that democratic back and forth. And if we make a really compelling argument and we take in the feedback and improve it, I think maybe we get a better solution. One thing I'm very proud of for the work at Desegregate Connecticut, we're known for the state level advocacy, trying to get state laws passed. That's very hard, but we have done so much organizing on the ground. I mean, we've spoken to 80 planning and zoning commissions. We've done walks all across the state in the big cities and small towns. We are listening.
And some of it's bad faith and very frustrating, and it's the same talking points over and over again, and you can't convince everybody. But we also know that the wealthiest of town, the poorest of cities, they're people that believe that there's a better future for these communities and that they believe that it means more people in this community. And that's a really good place to start, to say, okay, maybe this solution in New Haven works, but it's not going to be the same thing in New Britain or Hartford or Simsbury or Glastonbury. And that's okay. But it's so nuanced, it's so complicated. And, we're at the early days of what I hope is this abundance versus scarcity conversation of, we have been living in this scarcity world where somebody else getting something means I'm losing something, or the white parent doesn't want the kid in the school with somebody else because there are not enough resources. I mean, there's that mentality that we built around the society that's, I don't think is the only way we can organize ourselves. But, those are some very big conversations, and no 3-day conference is going to solve those problems. But I'm excited to have those conversations, and I'm excited to have those conversations in Connecticut.
I'm really encouraged to hear what DesegregateCT has done. If you've spoken to 80 planning and zoning boards, that's half the state, 169 towns in Connecticut. And it's that kind of education that's necessary over time to start to change and expand minds to, think outside of the box, that, that scarcity box that people are sort of trained to live in. The nutmeg donut is, the metaphor for Connecticut's towns. There are these empty holes surrounded by this richness of wealthy suburbs and dying economic centers in the cities. And you've got that in sort of one industrial town after the next in Connecticut. So we definitely need to start thinking of, how do we create consensus around changing how we approach our problems in Connecticut, particularly in Connecticut cities? Because you're always going to be outweighed by the number of suburban towns that don't identify with those problems and can't, frankly, relate to them by and large because people are so far removed. So I think that's really encouraging what you all are doing with RPA.
What's interesting,
DesegregateCT.
Well, thank you. And what's interesting about Connecticut, even relative to others, even Massachusetts, is there is Boston or New York City. Like, they're a massive, the big city, and that has a political orbit of itself. Whereas Connecticut has smaller
Stanford,
cities
which is the economic engine, but it's no Boston or New York.
Yeah, and we don't have that urbanism, political power in Connecticut, which can be really frustrating. Again, in a scarcity mindset, you've got all these cities. We had a working group with all the city planning for the big cities in Connecticut, and it's an awesome group, and they're all on the same team, they know, but you're still fighting for the same limited resources, and it's a very tough challenge. I mean, yeah, we say our cities are just as segregated as our suburbs are, and we want to fix that. And a lot of our North Star is, and it just tends to scare people, it's not necessarily something we lead with in the planning and zoning commissions, but as bad as the housing shortage and crisis is in Connecticut, it hasn't started yet. And what I mean by that is climate change is going to mean millions of people in the United States are going to be moving. We're already seeing that now. One of the cool things about YIMBY Town is we're going to have some folks from the insurance industry in Connecticut come and talk about, hey, it doesn't matter if you believe in climate change, it matters if your insurance company does. And belatedly, they're starting to price in these massive storms. And the places in this country where are growing and building housing are places that are probably the least sustainable. But we are not really ready to plan for that. And, if we're not smart about that, it could still happen, and it could make things even harder for us. If we're smart about it now, to say, wait a minute, Connecticut could be 5 million people by 2050 if we really plan ahead and think about what would that look like, how exciting that would be. Why not make Connecticut as cool as places in the South, or as dynamic as a Nashville or Austin? Like, why can't it be like that?
Yeah.
And what do we need to do now in 2025 to start that for 2035, 2045, 2050? And that's, the conversation we're at least trying to have started here.
I think you started that conversation in the perfect town because it's New Haven. All you need is pizza and...
Let me go. I'm really curious about, you say climate change is that the housing crisis hasn't really started, and then you see this increase in the population. Just I've not really thought about that. When I see climate change, I see what's that movie when New York City's underwater and it's frozen.
Day after tomorrow.
Day after tomorrow. So, and
That was
it is frightening, right? That movie will frighten you to death. I didn't think we're gonna burn up. Actually, we're gonna all drown, freeze. But why do you think that our population is going to increase so significantly because of climate change? How's that happen? People, explain.
Yeah,
it
I
to
think
me.
I'm not a doomsayer. I don't think it's going to be like, that on Hollywood movie. And places like Florida, for example, and I live in Simsbury, and I just anecdotally, and we have a couple of our interns that are college students or graduate students that have come from Florida. And those folks explicitly came because they saw the writing on the wall in terms of the storms coming through, their insurance rates going up, and just saying, I can't live here. And where are we going to go? That's going to be a place I can afford insurance. I can afford to know that we're not going to get, wiped out by a hurricane or something like that. And it's not, Florida is going to be underwater in 20 years, not at all, but is it going to be subsidized financially in the way that we have been doing that for generations? And I do not think that is going to be the case, whether it's, the condo buildings collapsing because of deferred maintenance or just in terms of insurance. We've been building in places that we have not priced in the risk for climate change and just in terms of, heat, storms and otherwise. And Connecticut has its risks. I'm not pretending otherwise. And we're looking at a harbor right now. This is a place that in some of the projections could be significantly impacted by some coastal change, but certainly relative to places in the South or the Southwest, we are better positioned in terms of weather to at least have a little bit more resiliency built into the geography. So that to me presents an opportunity. And the fact that I'm already seeing that anecdotally, and I mean, when we moved back to Connecticut and we're trying to get a house for a couple of years, it was crazy to think of people moving to Connecticut that had no ties to the state.
Right.
And my wife, who's from Los Angeles originally, took a little bit of selling to move to suburban Connecticut in the first place. Was like, her mind was blown that people like, what do you mean you didn't have a spouse here or a parent here? Like you just put a spreadsheet together, and we've absolutely are seeing that.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, given that the rate of taxes here and the cost of housing, those two things alone are disincentives for most people from the South to move north, right? So that people are now starting to sort of weigh that decision in a different way is pretty eye-opening to me, because I haven't sensed that trend. Now, I think you're probably on the cutting edge of looking at, okay, what are some of these forces? Along those lines, what do you think are the biggest challenges in municipal land use planning in Connecticut, and how do we address those?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of them. I was just at a thing earlier today, and someone was joking. The problem isn't we have 169 municipalities. It's we have 169 sovereign nations.
Exactly.
Exactly. I love that line. I've obviously stolen it.
Yeah, there's no counties.
Yeah.
to speak of.
The problem is,
county government.
as we know, housing markets are regional. They're not municipal,
Right.
and we are politically operating at that level. So somebody that says, I want affordable housing, but not in my town, they are going to assume a New Haven's going to build it, or
Hartford's going to.
Hartford's going to do it, or Bridgeport, and that's someone else's problem. Or just market rate housing is going to go someplace else. Yeah. And even in places like a New Haven or Stamford that are building the vast majority of the housing stock in Connecticut, that's a significant political burden and logistical burden on those populations and communities. And we've seen some pretty significant backlashes to that. And the argument to that is, well, we need everyone to do a little bit more. So I think at the local level in Connecticut, because we don't have county governments, frankly, we have a weak state government. It would be one thing if our state government worked like a county government, but it doesn't even do that.
Right.
So that's an issue where there are absolutely good faith logistical hurdles to building more. There's water and sewer, there's the things that are completely reasonable to say, what about this issue? And there just are not the resources, and the politics are not aligned I mean, if think about it, in the 50s and 60s in Connecticut, there were those like Chamber of Commerce municipal boosters that I want the plant in my town, or I want the housing in my town and not their town. And this is a great town to build and we should be growing. And that's completely gone from the rest of the political imagination in Connecticut. And,
Oh,
it's
most of
not-
those plants have gone too.
and most of those plants have gone. Yeah. I mean, it's what you think of growth in a municipal government. It's hard to see how does an apartment building help me, even though we know it does empirically, tax credits and everything, or tax revenue. But so it's a little bit of the imagination of it. It's a little bit of prisoner's dilemma of, if I'm the town or city that does that and nobody else does, I'm going to take a big hit for that, politically or whatever else. There aren't a lot of resources for me to help. So part of our work at the state level is, rather than try to storm the castle and get every town to do everything and change, it's where do towns and cities want this, and what are the gaps in the resources to actually give you that political support? Is it water and sewer? Is it better bus service? Is it brownfield cleanup? That's the work live ride proposal. It's just saying, okay, we need to build up state capacity, at least to help the communities that want to do this, to get the ball rolling, get that little bit of jealousy to say like, whoa, look at that town has this awesome little downtown walkable center. I want that in my town, and that virtuous cycle. So it's, there are absolutely logistical hurdles that I'm very sympathetic to for municipalities. And you've got to focus on those folks in those commissions, those first selectmen and mayors, and say, what resources do you need? And, it's been a struggle at the state level to get that kind of strategic vision to say, yeah, Connecticut could be a lot bigger. And I think the Lamont administration is saying all the right things. They're trying to do some bonding and some other things, but someone's just got to say like, get in, losers, we're going to the 21st century and it's going to be awesome. And it's, driving that narrative is not quite there yet for the local governments.
But the proof is also there. I mean, if you look at a section of New Haven or Stamford or anywhere else that's developing the work live right, when you have that going on, it just thrives because there's more for businesses to thrive. Yes, they may push some residents away because supply and demand, rents go high, but in all, I think the work live right aspect as a part of this helps for the longer for the bigger picture. So I want to actually ask you about more of that. How do you see other towns or other cities that you've been to that are doing it very well, the work live right, as it relates to pro homes or desegregate? Do you see those towns thriving more in terms of both affordable housing, market rate housing? Are they able to bridge the gap because of the work live right being so proficient in those towns?
Yeah, I mean, we're still waiting on it to pass and get started. But the exciting thing is there are communities that are embracing this, certainly. And obviously, like in New Haven and in Stamford, in terms of some of the bigger cities, and Waterbury, Hartford, they're trying to lay the groundwork for a lot of this stuff. And it's, that will happen. But yeah, I mean, there are historic examples in Connecticut. We always say like transit-oriented communities are an old idea. Everything in Connecticut was built around a river, a canal, or a train station. So that's already an old idea. So the Norwalks of the world and some of these great little places already exist and are there. So let's just get that muscle memory back. But even in places like a Milford or a West Hartford, which are seeing for smaller communities a considerable amount of growth, what's exciting about that is they are being thoughtful about it from a political leadership. They are being smart about doing it near the CT Fast Track or the Metro North Station or the Connecticut Post Mall. They're taking advantage of that plant is not coming back, but neither is that mall. That stuff's not coming back. How do we reuse the infrastructure that's already there, that capacity that's already there? Because fundamentally, we don't want to see sprawl. All the rural towns that are today farmland or green space and are freaking out about work live ride or any kind of development, I go into those P&Zs and say, I am your best friend because I also don't want a subdivision in your town. I want it to be in Manchester or West Haven. And a lot of times they want that too. So if we can get state resources into those communities, you are still going to benefit from your town because you're not going to see the development pressure that's going to happen otherwise. It's going to come to your town at some point. Sprawl doesn't stop.
where I grew up in Avon when we moved in the 80s was like, the sticks, and now it's bougie and everything. And Canton was farms and a golf course, and now that's bougie, and that's going to happen in New Hartford, that's going to happen in Barkhamsted, and so on and so on and so on. So we have that argument already to say there's no such thing as status quo in Connecticut. Like, it's going to come for you, and if you don't want it to,
830G is going to come for you.
yeah, and there's a lot we support 830G in a lot, but that argument of if we do it smart and do it a little bit at, dare I say, the regional level, we can everybody can get something that they want out of this, and all of that rising tide is still going to help those communities that don't want it. But it's nice having examples already that West Hartford is growing an immense amount. There are pressures there. Some of the market rate stuff in West Hartford Center is like $2 million. I mean, it's crazy. And that's not helping the affordability in some cases, but that money is coming into some of the developments there. But the argument really shows that this can happen. The sky isn't falling. The traffic isn't getting any worse than it already is because everybody's got to drive everywhere in Connecticut. The schools aren't being flooded. In fact, West Hartford, despite all that growth, is still projecting declines in enrollment across the school system because we know household age is going down. Milford is the same thing. They're building a lot. There's backs and forth, but even they are saying we're not going to see traffic increase or our school enrollments increase because of demographic trends and otherwise. So there are some really helpful examples, even outside of the bigger cities like in New Haven, that we can point to say the sky's not falling here, right? Like,
well, in most of these suburban communities, the market rate developments, primarily studios, 1 bedrooms, a few 2 bedrooms, but it's not family housing that's coming in as market rate, at least in multifamily communities, right? So that is what balances out the fears about school enrollments going up and, Board of Education budgets going up and so forth and so on.
Yeah, and I'm a perfect example of this. When we came back to Connecticut, I wasn't sure. I couldn't afford to buy a home, but my wife, I wasn't sure she's going to be excited about this. So we rented in Simsbury because we couldn't find anything to rent in Avon, where my parents were older and living. And we ended up really liking Simsbury and looked around Bloomfield and West Hartford and Simsbury for a couple years trying to find something. But we were in the town, and we were able to find something, and that gave me a leg into a community that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And that's the cycle that we want to see. And on the back end of that, if you provide those types of smaller apartments or condos, the seniors downsizing, my parents got very lucky that, like, my sister literally sent 50 letters to the one active adult community in Avon saying, my parents are trying to sell their house. Are you looking to sell your condo? Somebody bid on it. Said, oh yeah, I love that. I don't like realtors. So that's how my parents got their downsized place. And that's not typical. It shouldn't be that hard and crazy.
Well, most people don't have your sister.
Yeah. I credit to my sister for, putting on some shoes and doing that. But that cycle all across the economic level, all across the demographic level. I mean, again, going back to the climate change thing, anecdotally, my mom's friends are not moving down to Florida. They're coming back.
Yeah.
So we've had that kind of escape valve in the Connecticut housing market of the snowbirds or lower tax states. And that's probably not going to happen as much. So we need housing for young workers. We need family housing. We need low income housing. We need senior housing.
Yeah, all of it.
We need all of it.
Do you think the new administration, the Trump administration, is making a lot of changes, as we all know? How do you think that's going to affect a lot of the policies that are already in place around the YIMBY initiatives that you see?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a topic of conversation in terms of YIMBY Town. What I think a strength of this movement is it is bipartisan, and that there are center-right and center-left folks that agree we need to build more homes and are invested in that. But what do we make of the Trump administration? I don't personally believe it is a YIMBY administration. They've talked about deregulation, which is not the same thing. And certainly they're cutting some really significant housing programs that they're arguing it. So it's a big challenge for us, and that's probably the most stressful thing as we're planning this is what is that going to look like? And
I'm excited that there are going to be a lot of folks on the left and right that are going to come to this, but I think all of us are really trying to figure out, there are a couple of folks in the Trump administration that I would argue are, or at least YIMBY-esque or YIMBY adjacent, Doug Berman and Minister of Interior or Department of Interior. But what they're talking about doing to me is, selling off government assets and building communities in Nevada that they tested atomic bombs on or something, God knows what. Like, that doesn't seem to be good. I think cracking down on immigration is bad for our country, bad for our culture, but certainly bad from a construction standpoint. I think tariffs on all the production for housing and real estate is bad.
The prices.
And I think the rule of law is at risk, and you just can't have, as you all know, and you know better than I do, how hard it is to build stuff and how stacking up those finances, the predictability of it, you need all of those things to within an inch to make these deals work and this stuff get built, whether it's public housing or private housing. And he's blowing all of that up. So I think we have to be honest about that. And certainly YIMBY Town's going to have those conversations. But
I think what most people would say is this is fundamentally a state level or local level challenge. So, and I don't agree with that. I think it's all related. But certainly there are things we can do in Connecticut at the local level and the state level to make it a little bit more predictable and easier. But when that kind of headwind is coming in, just the uncertainty of it all is very tough.
And they're cutting resources that already exist, like the federal ARPA funds that came to states and have been distributed to various different agencies, often housing. I'm working on a project in New Jersey that the Trump administration is trying to claw back those funds. And there's a program with a state agency that was funded by that, which is providing the soft subsidy that makes this preservation project possible. And if they're successful in cutting that program or pulling those funds out, it kills the program and it kills this project. That's real, and we believe they were existing resources.
Yeah.
So that's sort of a sense of a look at the future from what they're doing right now.
Yeah. I fundamentally, we're a nonpartisan organization, and I believe the movement is bipartisan, and I want to project that, but reality is reality, and this administration at best is creating contradictory unpredictability, but I think at worst, it is a menace to the type of abundance we're talking about and the issues that we care about, from racial justice to climate change. So it's a big risk, and as we've got a few more months to really see how some of these things play out, but it's not encouraging. And I come back to the rule of law. This is a land use reform conference. We're not talking about all these other issues.
Yeah,
but
a lot.
At the same time, the rule of law matters a great deal, and respecting people's rights is at risk in a way that I think a lot of us are still caught off guard by, let alone just for construction and building. But so that's something I think the movement has to grapple with from a bipartisan lens. I think there are plenty of folks on the other side of the aisle in Connecticut or elsewhere that are also reeling about, wait a minute, what are we doing here? And what does this new paradigm look like? I don't think we're going back to whatever the previous paradigm was, and there might be an argument to not have done that, but what moves forward, if it's a fight over scarcity or a fight over abundance, whatever that lens is, I want abundance to win.
Jimmy, you had a question before. I think you were trying to say something earlier.
No. I think I now realize that I should not plan to buy a home in California.
Or Hawaii.
Because of the heat in
Florida.
Arizona.
And that I'm going to have to get used to the cold weather, but might not be as cold 10 years from now. It might be warmer.
But it won't be under.
It won't be under. So but I'm still thinking about how do we handle 2 million more people. I still I keep looking at the traffic now. because maybe I got recency biases, that as they call it, right? I'm trying to think about 2005, and I don't remember this in 2005 every day, all day. Even though we expanded the bridge and the highway, I don't remember the traffic downtown like this in 2005. I don't remember any of this in 2005. And maybe as you get older, you always say everything was better than back in the day. So I'm trying to think. This morning, the train got off the State Street station, walked to 360 Orange. It was something else. Cars were packed, turning the curves at high speed. I don't remember the walk being. I don't remember any of this. It just seemed to have been a calmer, less traffic. So I'm trying to think, how do we expand, even if it's over a 30 or 40 or 50 year period? How do we take this reverse migration? I mean, we have New Haven is really, when I came here in 2005 again, there was very little downtown. There was no housing downtown. And they had apartments going there for like $3,000, $4,000 a unit. I remember you could get a really nice apartment downtown in New Haven for $900.
Yeah.
And I thought that was excessive. So I'm still trying to grasp all of this change. In the midst of all this change, though, I never thought I'd see someone pay $4,000 or about the rent across the street from public housing. I mean, when I say across the street, I mean right across the street.
So then, in that case, you think the public housing will sustain when you have market rate housing charging $4,000, and how long would that be?
I don't know. We have 58,000 people on the Section 8 waiting list.
And you have how many vouchers?
4,000,
Yeah.
5,000. But the turnover is only maybe 400 or 500 a year.
Right.
So besides that, I think that's 100 years maybe.
Yeah.
So I work in this every day, and we do have uncertainty. We have properties that are trying to close, and then the HUD people are saying, get your request in for your money now, because it might not be there.
Right.
Everything is in a state of flux. It feels like 2008 almost, when the market collapsed. The uncertainty is driving us nuts. We have bids out, and then the agents are saying, well, did that bid include tariffs? I don't know. So I'm in a state of uncertainty, thinking about the present. I'm also planning, thinking about the future. And I do provide housing. We've done a lot of it in the last decade. We've built maybe almost 2,000 units of new housing. All the public housing in New Haven has been rebuilt, all of it. But in the neighborhoods where it was. And that was a struggle, because originally HUD wanted us to take those vouchers that we use, hard vouchers we call them, and use them and let people
It's portable vouchers.
portable vouchers. And we said, it's our money with MTW. We said we could use our money we want to. It gave us flexibility. And then we had the flexibility to take our vouchers, portable vouchers, and turn them into hard cash. HUD fought us and said, no. We want you to
Project based them.
put them on the street, give them 10 of these vouchers, let people move out. And we kept saying, there's nowhere for them to move to.
Right.
Let me build that's why I talked about earlier, let me build my own neighborhoods. And then they tried to change the MTW, where we had to put 95% of our vouchers at the ratio at making them put it on the street. That got killed a couple of times. So it's this constant tension of give people the mobility to move where they want to move. And a lot of them can't move to the suburban areas because of discrimination and everything else. A lot of them don't want to move. So I've become, I do YIMBY, but I am so much an advocate now of rebuilding the distressed communities. You have to rebuild the schools as well. But I found out that if I do the housing and do it well and do the community activism, that I will get a better school. I will get a magnet school, a charter school, or whatever. And I will get a neighborhood like Brookside and Quinnipiac, and I can, and on and on and on, that are now marvelous neighborhoods that rival any neighborhood in any suburbs. So that's my dilemma. I'm like to the point where I talked about it. Rather, they don't want to move. They don't want the zoning and the upzoning. They just want their neighborhood to
better.
do better.
They have their relationships and families and cultural community already there, and they would be isolated. In fact, in many cases, if they moved out to the suburbs, of course they don't want that.
They don't want that, and they got grandmama takes the baby in the morning time, and auntie takes it at lunchtime, and cousin picks it up, and they work at Yale, and all that fabric that you really get into when you do what Peter and I do. You see the fabric of and you see the highways. You see with I-91 that split, Worcester Square from, what's it called, Mill River, that went right through there, and you see on one side of the highway is one neighborhood that's pretty affluent and poverty. So we spend our efforts on trying to improve the other side of I-91, and we've done that. We have Mill River there now, and we have community there, and we've got other housing there, and you drive down now, and you see those that whole Grand Avenue neighborhood strip. It's vibrant, vibrant than any other strip around here. Now we're trying to do the same thing to 30 South. We're planning that. We're trying to build 2,500 units there. It's going to be mixed income.
Exactly. These mixed income communities do create economic opportunities in those neighborhoods. We've seen it with the Hope 6 program over and over again. And these larger developments like West Rock and Quinnipiac, it really does revitalize those communities if you do it with enough scale and mixed income.
Yeah. And we're going to build 2,500 units in Jersey South. Used to be 300 units of the most deteriorated housing imaginable. It's been torn down. It's been down since 2014, maybe.
Yep.
But now we are planning to rebuild it, make it a 70-30, 60-40 mixed income community. And it's going to revitalize all of the hill, per se, which is also segregated there by the Church South that's huge and can't get across it. And people on this side of the street don't know they're actually part of that side of the street. We have one of the 4th largest, most used train stations in the country, right? Yeah. That's amazing. Go there anytime, and it's just packed with people. And so I'm really I have this bias toward rebuilding these neighborhoods that were pretty much destroyed by urban renewal and the highway system, and so that's my tension. And then I've seen these incentives for housing incentives and things like that. So I'm just becoming an advocate of rebuilding existing communities, and you really at the same time got to build the schools because they're so segregated. All our schools are segregated. There are very few schools that are integrated. I was lucky enough to live in an affluent neighborhood, and my children went to schools that they weren't segregated, but they were, they went to predominantly white schools and predominantly white neighborhoods. So I was lucky enough to do that. At the same time, I do planning, I do development, so I see the stressed neighborhoods. I worked in Albany. Arbor Hill is a stressed neighborhood. I worked in New York City. I worked in New York City in the 1970s. When I lived in the Bronx. I lived in the South Bronx. So I've seen, and when I went back to South Bronx about 5 years ago, I took my daughter, and I tried to explain to her the South Bronx of the 70s. It was on fire.
Banana Kelly.
Yeah, it was on fire. She couldn't fathom it. So and South Bronx is where I talked about, it's still pretty, that neighborhood is still not totally gentrified. People still live there.
Yeah.
Rents are higher, but it's a community that you can walk around. It's pretty safe. So I've seen those communities revitalize themselves. And so that's my dilemma. It's like, how do you do the revitalized communities and let people stay in their communities as opposed to fight over upzoning the downtown New Haven?
Yeah, I obviously you weren't commuting on 95. When I moved here in 1990 from Park Slope, I was commuting to Stamford every day
That's different.
for 15 years. And I can't say the traffic was much better then than it is now. Of course, every year it seemed like the state was tearing up part of 95 to do, some kind of improvement. So that always backed things up. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look back.
Yeah.
I was working in East New York in the mid 80s, and that community has not been gentrified. I mean, little pockets maybe, but Brownsville more so. But yeah, this is a very long-term effort, and it really takes a long-term vision and commitment by a whole host of players to create lasting change in these communities. And we've run long, and I'm going to give you the opportunity to wrap up, Pete. What do you see as sort of the possibilities for Connecticut, given where we stand today?
And if you think the conference coming up is going to address some of those too, let's talk about it as we're wrapping up on this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about our work and the conference, and very much hope all of you are at the conference having this exact
We'll be there.
conversation.
We'll be there.
We'll follow
Sure.
up. But yeah, look, I'm doing this work because I'm bullish on the future of Connecticut and all the challenges that we face now, the challenges that we are facing in the short term, and what we're looking at in terms of the future. There is a lot of uncertainty. I'm not naive about it, but I just think there are a lot of people in the state in very different walks of life, parts of it, that care a lot about this. And if we can have a 3-day thing in New Haven where everybody gets together and kind of hears not just here's the answer, but here are these questions, and oh my God, look how many amazing, interesting people care about this that I didn't know, or in a different lens, all of a sudden we're exposed to all these different people across the country. I think that's a very exciting opportunity for Connecticut. And I think what would be very cool is 5 years, 10 years, 50 years from now, it's like, you know what, that felt like that NIMBY Town thing was like a pretty big turning point where a couple people got together, hadn't met before, or this commissioner talked to that person, that guy was there who's now the mayor here, and that woman is now the governor. And like, wasn't that cool that everybody was here talking about this stuff? And that's how I see this. On this side of it, I'm worried about the funding, the catering, all that stuff. And I have never done a big conference before. I have totally no idea what I'm doing. Yeah, I mean, what I think about on this side of it, yeah, I'm worried about all the fundraising and catering and all that stuff. But I'm just very excited about getting all these people together and telling the story of what New Haven has been and what it is now and what it can be. And same thing for Connecticut. And I think that is going to be hopefully a very galvanizing moment. I mean, I think we are doing some very cool things in this state that don't typically get a lot of attention, or it feels very lonely for a lot of folks doing this work. And to have a community that's, national come to the city and say, wow, this is some cool stuff. I mean, when people hear about Elm Cities and the mixed income housing, that's a huge part of the future for what we're going to be doing long after President Trump. Park New Haven, the parking authority that's doing a bike share, is fascinating for people in the mobility space. Cool. There are faith-based groups. Darrell Brooks doing passive housing for faith-based groups. And, Yale is trying to do some stuff around housing. That's not even for students or faculty. And they're trying to be, learn from what the Town and Gown stuff. So, I mean, there are some very exciting conversations happening that I think are relevant to a national audience that I'm really excited to have. And I think there's a lot nationally that can come in from blue states and red states and purple states that I think we can all learn for.
Great to hear those stories.
Yeah. And I just want people to say, like, I might move to Connecticut, actually. Like, I'm buying this, like, 5 million people by 2050 thing, and we'll figure it out, what's the alternative? The alternative is status quo, which is not good for all of us. It's not helping people that need it the most. It's not growing the state, and, just accepting this Connecticut can't be anything else I reject that. So I think that's going to be a part of the fun of all this is what could Connecticut be?
Yeah.
And I don't think it's that far away, actually.
Well, it's been great to have you to, share all of your experience with us, and we all really look forward to YimbyTown.
And Pete, how can people learn about how to register, how to get involved in the upcoming conference?
Yeah, yimby.town is the website. Registration is open. We're doing a call for speakers as well. Part of the fun of it is we don't really dictate all of the content. We have people come in from all over the place, locally or nationally, to say, hey, I want to talk about this. And we try to figure it out. So there's opportunities to be part of this conversation and drive this conversation. It's September 14th through the 16th, mostly at the Omni downtown, but we'll be doing all kinds of stuff around in some of the neighborhoods and some of the campuses. And there's going to be a lot to learn and a lot to experience. And particularly for the folks in New Haven, I have stolen valor because I don't live in New Haven, and I'm not pretending to drive it, but having folks that live here.
Can you tell where New Haven? Frank Pepe's.
But and we're gonna have lots of pizza. That's definitely one of the big themes. We're leaning into that for everybody.
Yeah.
But I've heard from a lot of my contemporaries in other parts of the country that were surprised that New Haven and Connecticut got it. And the second we started talking about it, they saw the enthusiasm and all the work that we're doing, and people are excited about it. So I think it's going to be a pretty exciting opportunity.
Well, we are certainly excited. As you know, our podcast is YMB Nation. Yes, in my backyard, we believe in what you're doing. So keep up the good work. And Jimmy, Peter, and I are very honored that you're able to join us today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for the pizza.
Yeah, of course.
You bet. You're going to have to take some with you. We didn't give you a chance to.
Yes, please.
Thanks for joining us and listening to today's episode of YMB Nation. Continue the conversation in your communities and on social using hashtag YMB Nation. Connect with V at www.vaseconstruction.com. Connect with Jimmy at www.sincereconsulting.com. And connect with Peter by searching Collaborative Development Consulting on LinkedIn.com. Please leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform so we can continue helping communities thrive. Email us at contact@yimbynation.com or visit the podcast website at www.yimbynation.com. Until next time.